Dada was a legend of freedom only after the fact. In the act, it was a Gnostic myth of the 20th century. It was a secret history not only of the Great War, but of all the I have a rendezvous with death poetry written to extract meaning from the war. On Dada terms, to justify it. Francois Truffaut's Jules and Jim is a version. With Jules and Jim, conventional bohemians, rational and passionate in their ways, both real people on the screen, and Jean Moreau's Catherine, her face first glimpsed in a field of abandoned statues, Dada, junk, unreal but irresistible, the fatal spell. Much has been written about the Cabaret Voltaire as a protest against the war. The Dadaists wrote a lot of it. Arp in 1948, quote, "Disgusted by the butchery of World War I, we devoted ourselves to the fine arts. Despite the remote booming of artillery, we sang, painted, pasted, and wrote poetry with all our might and main. We were seeking an elementary art to cure man of the frenzy of the times and a new order to restore the balance between heaven and hell. This art rapidly became a subject of general disapproval. It was not surprising to us that the bandits were unable to understand us. In their puerile megalomania and power madness, they demanded that art itself must serve to brutalize mankind." In other words, instead of war for war's sake, or art for war's sake, or even war for art's sake, art for art's sake, or anyway, art for the good of humanity. Such notions might have made the papers in 1916, but they were hardly the stuff of legend, let alone myth. Rather, old-fashioned romanticism or knee-jerk bohemianism. Writing in 1920, Holzenbeck had a different idea, or a different voice. Quote, "We had all left our countries as a result of the war. We were agreed that the war had been contrived by the various governments for the most autocratic, sordid, and materialistic reasons. We Germans were familiar with the book J'accuse, and even without it, we would have had little confidence in the decency of the German Kaiser and his generals. Ball was a conscientious objector, and I had escaped by the skin of my teeth from the pursuit of the police myrmidons who, for their so-called patriotic reasons, were massing men in the trenches of northern France and giving them shells to eat. None of us had much appreciation for the kind of courage it takes to get shot for the idea of a nation which is at best a cartel of pelt merchants and profiteers in leather, at worst a cultural association of psychopaths who, like the Germans, marched off with a volume of Goethe in their knapsacks to skewer Frenchmen and Russians on their bayonets. That last sentence is pure Dada, or at least the sort of Dada this book pursues, a voice of teeth ground down to points, more suited to manifestos and hit singles than to poems, a near absolute loathing of one's time and place. The note held until disgust turns into glee. But as Dada, that voice surfaced only in Berlin in 1918 and for a year or two after. It was not the kind of Dada one could have found in the Cabaret Voltaire, which this book also pursues. There in 1916, an experiment was performed in which the language by which the war was justified was destroyed. In the story Dada told, this destruction was a necessary preliminary to the discovery of a language so plain the very act of speaking it would grind one's teeth down to points. A disciple of Kandinsky and a follower of Thomas Müntzer, Bakunin, and Kropotkin, Hugo Ball was always torn between defilement of authority and abasement before it. Experimenting with narcotics in 1915, he wrote in his diary, "I can imagine a time when I will seek obedience as much as I have tasted disobedience, to the full." He reached for a private megalomania to set against the public megalomania of the epic. "I could not live without the conviction that my own personal fate is an abbreviated version of the fate of the whole nation," by which, as a good German philosopher, he meant the fate of the whole world. Well before Ball opened the Cabaret Voltaire, he wrote a dirty poem about the Virgin Mary. Der Henker, the hangman. He wanted to fuck her, he said. But that was also before he began his diary, in which he testified that this was nothing. I once used to carry a skull with me from city to city. I had found it in an old chapel. They had been digging up graves and had exposed 100-year-old skeletons. They wrote the dead person's name and birthplace on the top of the skull. They painted the cheekbones with roses and forget-me-nots. The caput mortuum that I carried with me for years was the head of a girl who had died in 1811 at the age of 22. I was in fact madly in love with the 133-year-old girl and could hardly bear to part from her. This living head here. Emmy Hennings from 1913, Ball's mistress, after 1920 his wife, after 1927 his widow. Reminds me of that dead one. When I look at the girl, I want to take some paint and paint flowers on her hollow cheeks. Certain passages from Ball's diary appear in almost every history of Dada. This one never does. Ball defined the terms of the Cabaret Voltaire in advance. On 25 November 1915, he wrote, "People who live rationally and precipitately easily lose control over their impressions and are prey to unconscious emotions and motives. The activity of any art, painting, writing, composing, will do them good, provided that they do not pursue any purpose in their subjects, but follow the course of a free, unfettered imagination. The independent process of fantasy never fails to bring to light again those things that have crossed the threshold of consciousness without analysis. In an age like ours, when people are assaulted daily by the most monstrous things without being able to keep account of their impressions, aesthetic production becomes a prescribed course. But all living art will be irrational, primitive, and complex. It will speak a secret language and leave behind documents not of edification, but of paradox." "7 decades on, this translates easily, but as with Arp and Hulsenbeck on Dada as protest, one has to pare away the conventional to find the element around which the story turns. First off, there was borrowed Freudianism, art as psychoanalysis, art as cure, plus enlightened solipsism versus brainwashed mass society. The embrace of the irrational and primitive is just 1915 cafe talk, a blurb for expressionism and cubism, a leap on the bandwagon of Filippo Marinetti's then-hot futurism, a ride leading straight to Breton's surrealism. But Ball's last words, quote, "It will speak a secret language and leave behind documents not of edification but of paradox," end of quote, remain strange. This was what Lefebvre would respond to. It was the heart of the vaudeville show, a reach for the Gnostic myth. Everyone who made it felt it. They were never masters of the paradox, but simply messengers, or, as the years went on, victims. For the rest of their lives, save for Ball, the members of the Cabaret Voltaire sextet lived a long time. They returned again and again to their few days in the Zurich bar. They tried to understand what happened to them. They never got over it. This is the best evidence, the only real evidence that something actually happened in Zurich in the spring of 1916, something the art history version of Dada can only cover up. From the beginning, it was commonplace to hear punk described as Dada. Here are the lines that got me interested, written by Isabel Anscombe in 1978. Quote, "Punk must be willing to reject itself as it becomes established, to be open to change and to forgo the profits. It is a mode of anarchy as much as the Dadaist Cabaret Voltaire at the end of the First World War. And how many people are particularly familiar with that?" End of quote. A lot of people, it turned out. Andrew Szajowski, who ran the Roxy, told reporters it was, quote, "a sort of new Cabaret Voltaire," end of quote. Plenty of punks had done time in that traditional spawning ground of UK rock bands, the state-run art school. Punk made the dailies as Dole Q Rock and made the monthlies as Another Art School Demo. Still, Anscombe was working on an idea and opposed to literary references. Ideas about punk and Dada were almost non-existent, as she wrote. In London or New York in the late 70s, Dada meant what it meant in Paris and New York at the end of the First World War. A not-quite-naked prank, a jape clothed in the barest G-string of aesthetic authority, a Bronx cheer in three-part harmony, Sarah's affirmation of the right to piss and shit in different colors. It meant Arthur Cravan getting up to deliver a lecture and dropping his pants, a young John Lennon urinating from a Hamburg balcony onto a passing line of nuns. "Let's baptize them!" The Sex Pistols saying fuck on TV. Dada meant a charming, gratuitous act, amenable to some future art historical homage, as opposed to the uncharming, simplest surrealist act. Breton's man shooting blindly into a crowd, which, since no surrealist ever did anything of the kind, devolves into the sort of Dada. devolves into this sort of Dada, into a literary reference where it meets Zed, a punk gang leader played by Bob Goldthwait in the 1985 film Police Academy 2, their first assignment. In his mid-20s, but seemingly superannuated, fat, balding, sweating, drooling Zed heads thugs signed as punks by their multicolored hair and studded leather. By 1985, the diffused and floating signs of London, 1976. They terrorize a neighborhood for lack of anything else to do with it. Zed is so full of rage he can barely talk. You can feel his vocal cords breaking up every time he opens his mouth. He's a cuddly anarchist, blithering but lovable, when he tells the mayor, "I voted for you," while his gang trashes her community outreach street fair, when he says, "Thank you very much, you've got a lot of nice bargains here." After they've unloaded a supermarket, there's not a hint of sarcasm. On some level, he's completely sincere. He wants the mayor to drop dead of shock. He also wants her to like him. "Be reasonable," a cop begs him. "I hate reasonable," he screams. You feel for him. He's just a boy who can't say yes. Any art critic could pin him as Dada. Just as in 1965, every art critic pinned Andy Warhol as Neo-Dada. "Dada is a tomato," said one Paris Dada manifesto. "To wear a tomato in your lapel is to be a Dadaist," said another. Textbook Dada in a phrase. Absurd negation that wants no consequences. Unless it's the kind Zed's antics produced. In Police Academy 3, he became a cop himself. In the late 70s, punk as Dada did not even mean this much. It meant the history and nutshell parallels always needed to explain something new or explain it away. Wasn't there a British band that called itself Cabaret Voltaire? Didn't Talking Heads set a Hugo Ball sound poem to music on their first LP? Every book on Dada told the story of Kurt Schwitzer's combing his Hanover streets for cigarette butts and discarded concert tickets to stick into his collages. The formal Dada theory that art could be made out of anything matched the formal punk theory that anyone could make art. "Here are 3 chords," read the famous notes to a diagram in Sniff and Glue, the first UK punk fanzine. "Now form a band." The Dadaist logic of sucking in all the trivia, the rubbish, and the cast-offs of the world, and then stamping a new meaning on the assemblage. Ran a typical gloss on Zara's recipe for Dada poetry. Cut words out of a newspaper, shake in a bag, paste at random on a page. Was there both in punk's music and sartorial regime? It was true. There were punk songs about cigarette butts, and a 77 London punk jacket could look like a 1918 Berlin Dada collage. Why, though? And so what? Why form a band? Historical validation turns every no into a yes if the no can be footnoted, just as those who are always happier to announce the death of something than be present at its birth have mastered the knack of turning a casual aside into an embrace of the whole social order. Yes, the safety pin Jamie Reed put through HRH's lips in his God Save the Queen graphic harked back even more loudly to Duchamp's defaced Mona Lisa than to the May 68 Atelier Populaire poster. But Johnny Rotten had not said the word Dada since he was 2. No one tried to use Dada to find the limits of punk or vice versa, to start a conversation between the past and the present, to wonder just how it is that an idea jumps a 60-year gap or burrows under it. Instead, there was a setup. The Dada aesthetic went into the books as anti-art. Punk was anti-rock. The basic Dada act was understood to be the performer's attack on the audience. Punk swore and spit from the stage. Like punk, except for a few favored saints, Dada refused all ancestors. "I'm not even interested in knowing if anyone existed before me," Zara announced, quoting Descartes. You could find the footnotes in the songs. Quote, "Anti-art was the start," end of quote, as Polystyrene sang. Dadaism is a stratagem by which the artist can impart to the citizen something of the inner unrest which prevents the artist himself from being lulled to sleep by custom and routine. By means of external stimuli, he can compensate for the citizen's lack of inner urgency and vitality and shake him into new life. Udo Ruxer, Dada Almanac, 1920. My ultimate vocation in life is to be an irritant. Not something actively destructive, but someone who irritates, who disorientates. Someone who disrupts the daily drag of life just enough to leave the victim thinking there's maybe more to it all than the mere humdrum quality of existence. Elvis Costello, 1978. The parallel was obviously correct. As a fan, I didn't know what to make of it. I had books by Ball and Hulsenbeck on my shelves, picked up on Remainder years before, but I hadn't read them. In art history surveys, one learned far more about the proto-surrealist Parisian Dada spin-off than its putative Zurich progenitor, and surrealism was what the historians really wanted to talk about. The parallel broke down when you put the art of the one against the other, if you weighed punk singles against Dada paintings and poems. I couldn't believe it when I first heard it, a friend said of X-Ray Specs, "Oh, bondage up yours." It was so funny. It was funny and scary. You heard Polystyrene's Shirley Temple voice. Quote, "Some people say that little girls should be seen and not heard, but I say," end of quote, "turn into a raw meat social chug-a-lug." Quote, "Oh, bondage up yours," end of quote. The opening parodied anyone's expectations, and the follow-up ruined them. Laura Logic kicked off her saxophone solo as if she were kicking down a door, which was exactly what she was doing. Irony was never so exciting as in the Buzzcocks' boredom. Quote, "Scene here pretty humdrum," end of quote, Howard Devoto snapped as if the notion had just occurred to him. Forget history. The sound of the record was so edgy it simply had to be new. The advert's Gary Gilmore's eyes was a pure punk notion. What if Gary Gilmore had donated his eyes to an eye bank and you got them? Too pure to be anything else. Compared to this, Zurich artworks were tame. I ran the single number of the May 1916 review Cabaret Voltaire on microfilm, and there was one explosion. Quote, "L'Amiral cherchait une maison allure," end of quote. The transcript of a German, English, French, Hulsenbeck, Janko, Zara simultaneous poem as performed in the cabaret. Easy to imagine on stage, fabulous to read, dragged down by Zara's laborious Note pour les bourgeois, where he explained that the point was to translate cubism into verse. But the layout was sober. The new man dressed up in the old man's best suit. The result was pious, a sort of avant-garde mass. Whatever happened in Zurich in the spring of 1916, no tape recordings, no videos, no live LPs on the Ephraim label equivalent to the Roxy London WC2. It wasn't in the archives, and whatever happened, most ran from it. With the cabaret a dead letter, in 1917, Ball, Janko, Zara, and followers like Hans Richter set up the Gallery Dada, offering poetry readings, lectures, and revivals of last year's hits to women's clubs and package stores. "We have surmounted the barbarisms of the cabaret," Ball wrote. Simon Frith visited an Australian punk club in 1979, and all he saw were rules and manners. He measured it against 1976, so long before, when people, quote, "didn't know what would happen next," end of quote. In the Gallery Dada, Ball and the rest knew what would happen. Nothing. They restaged the number with the big costume. If TV had existed, they would have been on it. Except for Hulsenbeck, who frothed at the mouth, no one liked to talk about this very much. Soon enough, Ball and Hennings went back to the church. Zara and Arp attached themselves to Breton and became famous. Janko, too, came to Paris, disgusted by what he saw as the surrealists' attempt to put the Dada spirit in their pockets. He went back to Romania and slipped into obscurity. Ultimately, Hulsenbeck became a distinguished New York psychoanalyst, changing his name to Charles R. Holbeck, both to Americanize it and to kill his Dada past. In the Cabaret Voltaire, Arp was 28, Hulsenbeck 24, Zara turned 20, Janko 21. As old men, they had every right to dismiss their Spiegel gas hijinks as juvenilia. But they didn't. They tried to. With Dada gone in the 1920s, they disavowed it almost with the fervor of 1930s communists damning the god that failed. But it didn't work. The Cabaret Voltaire crept back and trivialized all their works and days. It dissolved them, just as on stage in the Marais they had dissolved the past. As the Dadaists got older, faced death, thought about their legacies, the syndrome worsened. They were humble in their megalomania. They spoke of Dada in terms so abstract and contradictory no one could really understand them. If punk was like Dada, then there was something in punk no one had glimpsed. Even though the old Dadaists were now like pop stars condemned to roll their greatest hit up the hill of the crowd for all eternity, carrying the curse of having been in the right place at the right time, a blessing that comes to no one more than once. Describing the scene on stage, Arp wasn't reporting. I said he was just to give the scene much more punch. In truth, he was writing in 1948, past 60, working from a reproduction of Janko's lost 1916 painting, Cabaret Voltaire, using it as flesh for memory. Janko's Emmy Hennings was not doing the splits. At the same time, Hulsenbeck and Zara were entering the 32nd year of their fight over the authorship of the word Dada. "I was the young man," Henry Lefebvre will speak of after I am dead. Zara might have said, "No, I was." Holzenbeck might have replied, "And I won't be. Top that." In early 1984, Jenko was 88. On 5 February 1916, he and his brother Jules had appeared along with Zara in response to an announcement Ball had placed in the papers. Along with the rest, on the first night, he hung paintings and tacked posters on the walls of Jan Ephraim's bar. Now, 68 years later, in Ein Had, Israel, the artist colony he had founded in 1953, he was trying to recreate the Cabaret Voltaire under the same name. New versions of discoveries he'd faked in the Gallery Dada when at 21, he had already gone as far as he would ever go. Quote, "Poems read simultaneously in different languages," end of quote, said the Jerusalem Post. Of course it was pathetic. At the crest, the stone always rolls to the bottom, and only one tied to it by curse can move it up an inch. Janko sat square in his chair with a bouquet in his hands and a beret on his head. Everyone else who had been there was dead. Quote, "How would the Dadaists respond to the reconstruction of their acts?" End of quote, a reporter asked Steve Solomons, director of the Ein Had Cabaret Voltaire. Quote, "They'd say it was absolutely ridiculous," end of quote, he said, but as a Dadaist, everything he said was a lie. Janko didn't think it was ridiculous, or if he did, he had nothing more or less ridiculous to offer. In the midst of the permanent Arab-Israeli war, with inflation rising by the day and Orthodox rabbis marshaling the full power of the state for the enforcement of rules so arbitrary they read like the stipulations of one of the fanatical Dada manifestos Holzenbeck offered to Berlin in 1918, Janko's message was, "Back to chaos." "Artists can communicate better than politicians," he said. He was talking about communication between certain Israelis and certain Palestinians, or Syrians, Lebanese, whoever might notice. Weren't there some who had more in common with him, or what he stood for, than he or they had in common with the official culture, supposedly their own? Janko was working against the clock. A new time, a new place. Who knew what might happen? He died on 21 April 1984 before he could explain. But if he had lived another lifetime, he would not have been able to explain, which is not to say that some who heard him might not have understood.